All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Well, hello and welcome to the actual Anarchy podcast. Is the podcast where we talk about movies from a Rothbardian Anarcho-Capitalist perspective. And tonight we're going to be talking about the origins of the English language, or at least the Oxford Dictionary, as we are going to review the movie The Professor and the Madman, starring Mel Gibson and Sean Penn. It came out just about a year and a half ago, and it's pretty good. I'm going to blow my load right here. It's pretty good. You can find the show notes more at actualanarchy.com/224. And before we get to the last narrative portion of the show and introduce our guest, who is a bit of a linguist, who will have many interesting things to say, let's check in with Robert, see how things are going. I know you've had a few things happening recently. Has the snow melted, and are you back up in operation with the restaurant?
Well, thanks, Daniel. Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm back. We're doing another episode for a movie film that talks about words and stuff. So I'm going to use my good words to talk about that. Yeah, I am back up. The snow has melted. It keeps snowing because I am rather high up, about 20. Am I 24 or 27? I can never remember. It's either 2,400 feet or 2,700 feet. Maybe it's 2,300 feet. I don't know. Anyway, but whenever it rains down in town, it's snowing up where I'm at. But then it's warm enough to melt off, so everything's good. And then, yeah, the restaurant is up and running, and we're having fairly high volume days. Like, things are back in full effect. We are taking on new employees, training them up, and hopefully we'll be able to, service our customers. But I want my own restaurant. That's what I want. And we're working hard to get that done.
All right. Well, that's interesting news. And I'll give you a little teaser. Next week, we're going to be talking about something right up your alley. We're going to be talking about the movie Chef, this Jon Favreau film. If you haven't seen it, I think that you will enjoy it. And our guest next week thought of it just specifically for you.
Oh, chef, huh? Well, I am not a chef, but I do deal with chefs. I talk to chefs every day, talking about, do this for me, do that for me, cook this, cook that. I'm really good at bossing chefs around. So, maybe I'll find something to like in that movie. As long as there's a chef being bossed by a guy that kind of looks like me, I'm on board.
Well, it sounds like that.
I need representation, Daniel. I can't
King
identify with a movie unless there's somebody that looks like me on the screen.
Okay. Well, I was just going to bring up, the Burger King tweet that said a women's place is in the kitchen. And they posted that on Women's Day or whatever. And of course, it sparked some controversial outrage, people responding to it. But then the thread continued, and they were like, that's why we're going to be, promoting all of these people and paying for their culinary art education, whatever. I mean, it's freaking Burger King. So, I mean, what do you really need to learn? But it was pretty funny. It's like the it's sort of the troll level of marketing. And I think it was pretty effective.
Yeah, it sounds like a troll marketing. They intentionally said something that sounds controversial to get a whole bunch of eyeballs on them. And maybe it'll backfire a little bit, but at the end of the day, the brand visibility shoots through the roof. So I don't think they're too crying. I know they came out with an apology that said our tweet was wrong or something. But the initial effect is what they're going for, to garner so many eyeballs, is already achieved. So then they can come out later with some whatever apology, and the effect is sustained.
Right. And who, I mean, I didn't even know they apologized. And so, the effect for me was, well, I heard about the cool tweet, but not the lame apology. So mission accomplished. And our effort to do something controversial and troll marketing is to have our guest who's joining us right after these messages from the Last Nighters. You'll see in just a moment. Hey everyone, it's Daniel Elwood and Robert Paul Johnson, and we are the Last Nighters. You can find us on the Liberty Movement's YouTube channel and also at lastnighters.com. We're going to be talking about the Professor and the Madman with the professional asshole tonight, and this is episode 167 of this show, and you can find the show notes and more at lastnighters.com/167. The professional asshole has been with us quite a number of times in the past, and most recently he was on for the James Bond film From Russia with Love in honor of Sean Connery shortly after his passing. He's also been on for 310 to Yuma and a host of other films. I think also a few Mel Gibson ones like Edge of Darkness and perhaps even more beyond that. I just can't quite recall, but welcome back to the show, Professional Asshole. I'm going to unmute you and put you on main screen. Oh, I can't unmute you. You have to unmute your own self. There you go. Welcome back.
No, thank you guys. I appreciate you having me. We seem to be on a kick here of doing based sexist. We started with, based Mel in Edge of Darkness, avenging his daughter. And then we moved on to, the based Sean Connery, who just couldn't get enough slapping women. He just that's what fueled his 007 skills, was slapping women. And now we are back on to Mel. In probably one of his least sexist roles, but it's still Mel Gibson, and we can always appreciate that.
Yeah. If anything, this is one of his more steady roles where he seems to be uncontroversial in most respects. Maybe back in Victorian times, some of what he did would be considered controversial at the time, but I think to our eyes, and granted, I have a hard time knowing what's controversial anymore, because what was controversial 5 years ago is not the same now. Like almost anything can be controversial now for any reason. So it really doesn't matter anymore. It's like lost all of its sense of meaning, which of course is a nice segue into talking about this movie and the origin of words and what they were trying to do to catalog and understand the is it called etymology, like the progression of words and their meanings and nuances, and how you can utilize language to convey ideas, and how those words can get obfuscated and deliberately misused and abused and acquired by opposing factions to be twisted into other things. And it gets into very Orwellian territory where and that's kind of the angle I wanted to take a little bit with this is, what is the purpose of language? Let's talk about that and how it relates to this film and what were they trying to do in this movie?
Well, I'll do my best to be a good worder during this whole, what is it called? Show something?
Make good word.
I'm going to make some good words here.
Don't make them too big.
I won't. Yeah. Definitely nothing like few, whatever that word is you used. And I forget what it was. Yeah, something about Greek, Latin, or Greek word for roots, atum, and ology, meaning from words. So yeah, we'll see.
Right. See, I'm throwing all of my big brain words out here. Big brains on Brad. Like
$5 words out here going on.
That's right. Well, I got a few $5 words in the Google description, which is how we will normally start off this show here. So let's go to that. It is The Professor and the Madman. Came out in 2019. It's a drama/historical drama, 2 hours and 5 minutes. It's on Netflix, which I don't have. It's also on Canopy, which is funded via taxation, though I did utilize that. I got a little bit for my money, I guess. It got a 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb, 41% in Rotten Tomatoes, 3 out of 5 on Common Sense Media, and 91% of Google users liked it. The description reads, based on the 1998 book, The Surgeon of Crowthorne, by Simon Winchester, the life of Professor James Murray is portrayed as he begins work on compiling words for the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary in the mid-19th century. As he led the overseeing committee, the professor received over 10,000 entries from one source in particular, a patient at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, Dr. William Minor. The release date was March 7th, 2019 in Brazil and Russia. The director is Farhad Safinia. I'm sure I'm butchering that, but I believe that is also the director of Apocalypto, which is another Mel Gibson related film, or somebody who worked with Mel Gibson on Apocalypto. I'm mixing up my facts here. Box office of $6.2 million, so not a whole lot of money, but it stars the old Mel Gibson and, of course, Sean Penn. And if I recall in reading some of the research on this, there was some controversy that Mel Gibson was not given final cut, or the director was not given final cut, and so they're not too pleased with how this film turned out. And I think they disavowed it or said that they did not like the end result. So I think that might be interesting, because I watched this and I'm like, this is pretty good. Not too bad. I don't know what they would do different.
The final act is a little weak compared to the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
It stops focusing on the dictionary and starts to focus more and more on Minor's continued descent into further insanity and exclusion from other people around him that might be willing to help him, especially the wife of the man that he killed. And I think that the first two acts of the movie try to wind together Minor's improvement with his work on the dictionary. So as the dictionary is coming forward and becoming more developed, Minor is getting better, but then it cleaves very suddenly, and suddenly the dictionary continues to be produced while Minor starts to fall into greater insanity to where he can't even, he's comatose, or wasn't comatose, I'm trying to remember the word they used.
Catatonic,
yeah. But
yeah.
anyways.
Yeah, well, catatonic, I think that's where cat got your tongue comes from, isn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah. So Robert, I'm going to go to you for your opening. I know we're kind of like juxtaposed here. I'm throwing more $5 words at everyone.
I don't even know what these mean in context. I'm all confused.
So yeah, give me your take on the Google description and your opening salvo.
Okay. Well, Professor and the Madman, I had never heard of it up until I think I had seen like a commercial for it, and then it got lost in the mix. And then Daniel said, "We're doing it," and I didn't know what to expect at all. But the film, and probably the book as well, uses the old Jimmy Cameron trick, and I don't know, he probably didn't invent this trick, but he popularized it, or at least he's most famous for doing it, in the movie Titanic, where you take a historical event and then you bolt on a love story to make people give a shit about what's going on. Because I mean, if you take out the love story and the human element, there's probably enough in the whole treatment of the sanitarium, maybe. But I think the movie really gets its heart from the widow, forgiving him, hating him, then forgiving him, and then kind of falling for him at one point, and how that interacts with his madness, and how he's so haunted by his sins and his crimes that he actually sees the people as he's awake, not just in his dreams or whatever, but he sees them and he believes that they're like real or gonna get him still or whatever. And it's it's a powerful film. I found myself riveted, mostly through the tragedy of it all. It's a very powerful tragedy everybody's taken a hit in this movie in one way or another, especially the widow, but also, Sean Penn and his craziness. He's having a really bad day, a series of bad days that just doesn't, there's a few bright spots, but even the bright spots cause him pain, because when the widow finally loves him, that just makes things worse, because then he's like, now I've killed him twice because I've killed the husband in her heart too. He's just a super tormented soul, and he really caught my sympathy. If there's any kind of a villain in the movie, I guess it's the sanitarium runner guy with his kind of barbaric medical treatments. But these are the best treatments they had at the time, and they even look back at treatments in their past as barbaric. And of course, it reminds me of, I think, my uncle. We were having a conversation one time, and he was reminiscing that he had his some of his large intestine removed at one point, and that was just the best treatment at the time in the 60s or the 70s. And we would look back today, or even maybe 10, 15 years later, as that being barbaric. Just medical technology is such an accelerating force that it's almost like, not using, a cell phone. It's like using a cell phone from 10, 15 years ago. It's like, what are you doing? Nobody would do this. This is ridiculous. So, I kind of want to get into that a little bit, but for the most part, the film is quite good. Then you got Mel Gibson, who plays this kind of father patriarch guy, but even he has his difficulties dealing with these snobby aristocrat guys that it's funny. At one point, they have such hubris that they think they can halt the language, and we're going to define this thing that's constantly evolving and changing, and we're going to give a definitive answer for what this thing is, this thing we call English language. And we're going to say, we're going to be the arbiters of truth and whatever, and everybody else can follow us. But then at other times, they realize how ridiculous and impossible this task is, that it's constantly evolving. People are constantly creating a new slang, and that their task is futile, and that it would take lifetimes, and in fact, it would never end. At one time, finally, they realize, or they say out loud in the film, that this is a task that would never end, and there would have to be constant updates to this dictionary. And in fact, to this day, of course, there are constant updates to dictionaries, and even a dictionary is just like a communist survey. It's as good as it was when it was printed, maybe, but it's not any use to me. It can be used, but it's not necessarily, true for everyone at every time and every place, of course. So.
Right. And if I recall, some of the more recent additions to the dictionary in the past couple of years have been somewhat ridiculous, rather woke in that regard. But yeah, I think you have a lot of good points, and I think the one character who really seems to understand that it is a constantly evolving thing, that they just need to come up with a new approach to try to grapple with it, with a way to at least attempt to systematize a way of capturing it, is the Freddy character, who ends up being kind of the champion for what's his name, Murray?
James Murray.
James Murray, right. And the other thing I really liked about James Murray, speaking of the intellectual elitist snobs, is that they're all about having a degree, and having status, and that's what makes you smart. And you see a lot of that even today, where everyone assumes that having a degree means that you're educated. Well, of course, all it means is that you spend a lot of money to get a piece of paper that says you're educated, but really you're most likely, as most people are, just NPCs repeating things that have been indoctrinated into you. And I love James Murray's response to them, in that he just demonstrates his abilities to them. He talks about the various languages that he's very adept in, fully understands the ones that he's somewhat familiar with, and then gives the etymology of a word, clever, where its origins were from, and what it means, and these, what's synonyms for it, and like how it's used
Adroit,
in
skillful,
right.
sharp, keen.
So I was a big fan of that. I was a big fan of applied knowledge superseding a piece of paper that intellectual snobbery would deem to be education.
Well, and eventually they end up giving him the degree afterwards. So, like on the first edition of the first volume, covering letter A, it has James Murray, editor D. Lit, at the end of it, and that was their gift to him by saying, we're granting you an honorary doctorate of letters in this case, which is always supposed to historically be an honorary degree, but one conferred for extraordinary knowledge in a certain amount. Like I think, Thomas Sowell has been granted like 10 different doctorates of letters from different universities just in recognition of his contribution to economics. And similar people will get similar awards.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it certainly seemed, at least in this story, that James Murray was worthy of such, as he was the one to be able to come up with like this system of collecting this information. And he himself was a wealth of knowledge in relation to linguistics and origins of words. And he had an approach that was a breakthrough as far as getting something accomplished.
Indeed. Yeah. And I could see the value in, English, especially at that time, and still to this day, of course, even more so, I guess. But you're talking about a language that was essentially forced on like almost the entire planet through all these colonial wars and such. And you can only imagine how English runs into some African guy speaking his language, or some Indian guy speaking his language, or, Thailand, or any number of these South American places or whatever. You can imagine all the changes and bastardizations of that language. It would be, you can imagine that even his giant novel, like A was what, like 2 inches thick, 3 inches thick. And then it was like a big, huge thing. And even that would be probably only half, maybe a third of the actual, not even that much of the actual, because they had to do a massive amount of curating, I would imagine, right? Like they weren't like going into sub-Saharan Africa and going, all right, what are you guys' thoughts? They were just going with the English speaking people that donated ideas, and they were going off of like written books, right? Like whatever was written like in the past few hundred years.
Yeah, they went all the way back to even early English. In the case, they mentioned John Wycliffe, who wrote in the 1340s. He was, I forget exactly when he was executed, but yeah, his was the first English Bible, the first written book in English was John Wycliffe's Bible. So, and they had a major issue with the word accepted at the time, and that's a key feature of the beginning of the second act, is losing traceable abilities, the traceability of the word accepted. But yeah, it's interesting that they decided to go only with the written language because there's too much variability in spoken language, in that there are so many people who use it incorrectly. They'll use a word, they don't even know what it means. So there really is a need for some amount of curation. But as we've kind of been hinting at but never getting to, is the villain in the movie is in fact the bureaucrat who wants to define and order language from an a priori dictate coming out of the minds of these Oxford academicians, instead of recognizing language as what it is. And as James Murray puts it, we are not prescribing, we are describing what the language is and how it is used. And that task, we're not here to determine what language ought to be, simply what it is. And that in and of itself is a great anarchist principle, and the fact that there is no single centralized ordering of language. There are leaders in language. There are leaders in that some people who are better at it, who have better expertise or better knowledge or better ability, arise and keep the language in some senses having structure that can pass from one generation to the next. But of course, the difference between Old English, Middle English, and Modern English could be considered very different languages in a very real extent. But we can speak to somebody even from 200 years ago, we would understand them. And they can understand somebody from 200 years prior, but 400 years difference would probably be too much for us to actually understand each other to a certain extent. The pronunciation would be too different. The use, the terms, the lingo as it moves wouldn't make sense to us.
You know, it's always struck me when you read like some of the founding documents of the United States and the language that those people, the founding fathers, used just in their everyday letters, and how much more, I don't know, like larger words they would use and like more descriptive. And I wonder if it's
More
because, more formal, and it sounds like a very much of a higher intellect than we would be used to today. And it feels as if, while the number of words has, of course, grown over time, that the value of those words has almost diminished in some respects. And I wonder if there's like a certain phenomena that describes that, or if there's perhaps a theory as to why that has perhaps happened. One idea I have is just that they were handwriting these things, and so it's a little bit of a slower process, and they were using larger words, but fewer of them, to describe something as best as possible in an efficient means to do so, because they were allocating the amount of writing time they had to its best use, right? To communicate the ideas as succinctly as possible.
Yeah, and there are some theories to cover what you're talking about. The primary being that human beings can effectively work with about 20 to 50,000 words. That is the breadth of our knowledge in terms of words. Some other languages like Chinese, where it's a pictographic language, it's less because each individual pictogram is meant to depict more meaning and understanding. So they might have something like 5,000 words. A very educated person might have 20,000, but that's sort of a different setup. But in like Western and Indo-European languages, we have about 50,000 words. Now, as it is, the Oxford English Dictionary, I think right now recognizes about 350,000 words, with a common dictionary that you might buy at a bookstore having about 100 of those 1,000 words, 100,000 most common words. And the problem is, in the 1740s, I think if you go back to Johnson's dictionary, it has, I think, 20,000 words, right? So you could know every one of those words and use them. And the language has expanded so much to incorporate other languages, but even just invented terms, such as astronaut, computer, automobile, that we had to make room for them by eliminating less common verbs. Mostly it's verbs. So nobody really, our verb structure has really degenerated to the point where we really only have a couple of verbs: have, been, to have, to be, maybe a couple other helping verbs, to do. And then we use nouns in place of our verbs for the most part. And we do that by using a lot of what are called gerunds, which is when you add an ing on the end of a word. So instead of saying, I accept your offer, you might say something like, I'm good with it. So it's the way language is sort of degenerated, is that we have too many words. It's hard to keep track of. Plus, of course, there's sort of a democratization of language now in the form of television, radio, and social media, where it's no longer simply the intelligent and the finest and the top 1% who get their words going on through history, but every single idiot that ever existed. In addition, the other problem is that prior to the invention of the Oxford English Dictionary and its standardization, there were a broad set of English dialects that could almost be considered languages in and of themselves. I remember reading an article once about the topic where even within 20 miles of England, the word for egg was different than was in England. So, this English traveler is going down the Thames and he's about to hit the ocean. He stops off to, realizes he hasn't picked up enough eggs for his trip. So he goes and he asks the local lady, "Hey, can I buy an egg?" And she's like, "What the fuck is an egg?" And he just says an egg, like an egg, comes out of a chicken's ass. Come on, what the fuck? And this guy comes over and says, "I think he means an Eren," which is much closer to the German word for egg, which is Ei, E-I. And historically was Eir, which is E-Y-E-R-N, spelled almost the same. And to have it be, that was the middle of the 1700s, if I remember correctly from this article. And it's only 20 miles difference from London. And yet they had two different words for something extremely common and which would have been used in regular commerce all the time. So the idea of the standardization of the language, in a serious sense, allowed for the proliferation of trade, because you could have one word that made sense to everybody, even if you had local differences in what you might refer to something as. But at the same time, the idea of forcing it upon people is not only ridiculous and can't work, but is in and of itself, it's sort of a fool's errand in every way. You'll never be able to see the end of it as they struggle to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with what they were doing, right? I mean, they were trying to define their lovely language that they adored so much. But in the end, they're just offering it out to everybody, right? Like, this is our opinion on what all these words are, and you are free to read them, use them, or not. So, I mean, wouldn't those people that want to trade, have an incentive to adopt common terms with anybody that would want to trade with, right?
Or alternatively, that most merchants ended up becoming fluent in multiple languages and dialects so that they could at least communicate with other people. And of course, the merchant class for a long time they were the ones who would speak alternate languages. It's the local farmer only spoke one language, his own, his local dialect. And he sounded like a moron when he went into the city. Whereas the merchants would speak not only the proper dialect, but the local dialect, and usually their three biggest trading partners' languages as well. So
yeah, wasn't it only in the last couple hundred years where people even traveled beyond 20 miles from their home in their entire life?
For the most part, yeah, unless you were in a city. In which case, in a city, you would have such a conflagration of so many different types of people that you had to learn multiple languages, or at least have some sort of a, usually technically the term we use today is a Creole. And most people think of Creole as being Haitian Creole, but Creole technically refers to languages that have been mixed together unsuccessfully and without any sort of systemization. And in this case, so English itself almost started as a Creole language in a sense. It was basically you could call it Old German mixed with, technically it's more like Old Dutch mixed with French words, and that's how English kind of got born. But yeah, it's interesting the way that language evolves and sort of even devolves in a sense. They do talk about that in the language, and it's kind of scoffed off as being a little ridiculous that the language is currently at its purest, and from here it can only denigrate. And everybody's sort of yeah, whatever. We describe, we don't prescribe, blah blah blah. But there is a sense in which, yeah, languages do tend to devolve over time. And as a really great example, most of the ancient languages have a greater number of cases, tenses, and numbers, as well as more systematized use. So, like ancient German, for instance, has 3 numbers just like it has today, but it had 12 cases as opposed to the 4 it has today. And it had 6, I think it had 6 tenses, but maybe it was 8 as opposed to, again, 4 tenses today. You know, and it's interesting that over time people shed what is otherwise potentially extraneous uses for ones that matter, you know, are a little more common or a little more frequent or can match multiple meanings.
Yeah, it's all about efficiency, isn't it? I mean, who wants to sit there and describe something in 50 words when you could say it in 7 or 8 words, right?
Well, actually, it's the exact opposite. In ancient languages, you can describe something in 1 word that might take us 5 to say now. So, like, as a really good example, you know, and this is going really far back, you know, but like Indo-European, which is a sort of a theoretical bridge between all of the languages, but we can construct enough of it that we're pretty confident that it existed. You know, Indo-European, you know, if you were to give me a phrase that was like, you know, future potential case, right? So it's a subjunctive mood or something like that. If that being like, if this were to occur in the future tense and had to deal with some abstract concept. Well, in English, you know, the shortest number of words the fewest number of words that I could use to describe that would be maybe 5. If we go, you know, then I don't know, right? Like that's 8 words. Whereas in something like Indo-European, I could eliminate almost all of that meaning, get it down to 2 words, because it would have a future tense that's in the subjunctive mood. So there would not be a if, you know, if we go, right? Because it would already be understood that it's going to happen in the future and it's, you know, imperfective or something like that. You would just say, you would use the word go, but it would be parsed in such a way as you understand just in saying it, that it's future, imperfective, and subjunctive all in one. And you would say 2 words. If we go, then whatever. You know.
So would this make it incredibly obtuse to learn another language? I mean, what is it easier to learn other languages now? Will it be even easier in the future? Is that what you're saying? As the languages devolve and they all kind of homogenize a little bit?
It is interesting that, again, we look back at something like Indo-European and we need something like a PhD today in order to be able to read it and understand it. But at the same time, you know, the people back then, you know, because there were fewer words, the entire language might have only had, you know, 3,000 roots or maybe 5,000, you know, roots or something like that. And then you just, you know, technically the word is agglutinate based on that in order to develop your meaning and turn it into a phrase. I don't think that languages would have been, I think learning your own language would be quite easy, and learning another language would be much tougher back then. In the modern sense, I think, yeah, it's probably easier to learn most modern related languages because they're all relatively simply structured. There's just not a whole lot to learn. Like, you know, I took some German in college, and aside from having to introduce a third gender and, you know, so on and so forth, I understood how the language worked pretty quickly and easily because it still has the same number of tenses and cases, and they're the same cases and tenses as in English. But if I were to go learn something like, you know, Urdu, which is the same spoken language as Hindi, but different written language, it had a totally different case and tense structure, right? But it's not so completely removed that I couldn't learn it because it's still an Indo-European language. But if I were to go learn, say, like Mandarin or something like that, the concept of case and tense structure doesn't even exist in that language. So I'd have to learn a completely new way of thinking.
All right. Well, it sounds like there's some interesting things we can go further in the rabbit hole, but maybe we should direct this back towards the movie a little bit, because I don't want to lose anybody. But so, Robert, you were talking about the love interest kind of carrying some of the weight, some of the emotional weight, and caring about the characters in this. And you mentioned specifically the widow and her arc of course, experiencing this traumatic loss, having this seething hatred for the guy who did it, and then sort of feeling pity for him, and then maybe even a genuine love and forgiveness. But there was another female character, and I know Professional Asshole is going to love this, talking about the women characters. But the wife of Murray is, they kind of play into this a little bit, where she adopted the opposite kind of personality or what was needed as their family unit for the children, and became the support structure for him to basically enable him to better be able to be devoted to this project that he felt he had been training his whole life for, and that she was actually quite supportive in that for the most part. And she even goes to bat for him with this intellectual snobs at the end. Of course, not to much effect, but I found that her support of him in what he was trying to do was pretty compelling.
Yeah,
I agree.
a devoted woman. It's
It's a rarity.
not something I've really experienced a whole lot in my life. There's my mom, but that's kind of taken for granted. There's been, I think, one. Yeah, it's rare. It's rare. So yeah, she was definitely a good one. The way that she was able to change her behavior to allow him, and then when he wanted to quit, and she got upset about how all the sacrifices, and how it wasn't just him doing this thing, it was all of them. They were all on this team working together to do it. That was really strong. That was really powerful, and true. And I appreciated that she was quite aware of that, and that she had a valid point in there. And I think he appreciated it too in his character. So ultimately, he kept on going on with the project, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
But I think he also had like an awareness of like he was maybe disappointing her. Like there seemed to be these moments where he'd like look up or like go back on Christmas Eve or in the middle of the night to continue to do work, and then she'd turn the light off, and he knew he was pissing her off, but he was so devoted to the work that, I don't know, it seemed to be a challenge that he knew he was maybe upsetting her, but that she was sort of okay with being upset. Like she was considering that a sacrifice. And that was one of the things that made her want to kind of push him to see it to the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think from what I'm hearing up from everything that Robert's saying, it's, all I can say is incel. And what's the matter? You can't handle a strong woman, a strong, independent woman who cheats on you? And just because a woman cheats on you doesn't mean you didn't do something to deserve it.
Did we invite like a progressive feminist onto the show when I wasn't looking? Is that what happened, Daniel?
I don't know what's happening at this point. No, it's good. It's good. So let's get into Chester Minor. Is it William Chester Minor? So somewhat of a personal like connection to this guy in a weird way. I have a psychology degree, and so we studied a lot of these like old.
Now we know where the feminists came from.
Yeah, exactly. But where these old like procedures that were later frowned upon, and that was an interesting thing that you brought up, Robert, because this is like the 1870s, 1880s, and they're referring to things they were doing just a few years prior as being barbaric, and yet they were doing things that were barbaric. And in the future, there were other things like electroshock therapy that would later then be considered barbaric, but these were all like cutting edge at the time, which sort of relates to the thing that Professional Assholes was saying, that we're at the peak of the language and it can only go down from here, where everyone thinks that they're always at the forefront of the age of technology and advancement and progress. It's like this I think Rothbard called it the Whig theory of history, where essentially anything newer is better by default just because it's newer. without kind of this understanding that things kind of ebb and flow, and some knowledge is lost, and there are revolutions that kind of occur in that whole process. But the connection to Miner beyond that is his half brother was the mayor of Seattle in the late 1800s. And there's a school named after him called T.T. Miner. It's like an elementary school or whatever. And I don't want to say robbed, but I was persuaded to give a guy with an ankle monitor bracelet on his ankle, give him $5 so that he could get back to wherever he needed to be for the monitor to kick in. And he said that he grew up in that neighborhood and that he went to T.T. Miner school as a child as a way to ingratiate himself and lend validity to his, of course, fake story that he was giving me, where he said that, a lot of bad things happen in this neighborhood. It sure would be a shame if something bad happened. And meanwhile, we're in the alleyway behind the house I was living in. So I was like, okay, here's $5 as like an insurance policy. Leave me alone. But then before that, I lived on Miner Avenue in Seattle, of course, named after T.T. Miner, the half brother of Chester Miner. And Robert, where we grew up, that's where that guy died in a canoeing accident between Camino and Whidbey Island.
Is this like 6 degrees? Was that 6 degrees of separation?
And then Kevin Bacon was
like
there.
less.
I'm seeing this mostly as we need to cancel this movie. I mean, seriously, because you were robbed, right? And obviously that had to do with the toxic masculinity left over from the Civil War era that floated its way down to T.T. Miner, right? Exactly. That floated down to T.T. Miner and infected the entire area, especially Seattle, with all this toxic masculinity that created the harsh economic conditions where a poor person might be requesting money from you. And I can't believe you didn't fucking give it to him willfully and joyfully. I mean, you should have known that this guy needed your fucking help, and you are a piece of shit for not giving it to him.
No, I did. This
is like your
and why didn't you give him more?
Yeah, you should have given him more. Exactly. This is your toxic masculinity coming from the toxic masculinity of the Civil War that floated down through T.T. Miner into your veins, into your very skin.
It was only your white supremacy that allowed you to have that $5 to begin with, so you should have given him 10.
Exactly. You are a piece of shit.
Thank you both. Now, I will tell you that there was another event that happened in Seattle where I did not part with any money. I was walking down a very wide sidewalk in downtown, at least, 12 feet wide, and a guy carrying a leftover, like, doggy bag style styrofoam receptacle, which I'm sure is illegal now, veered into me and then threw it on the ground. And
because he's an adult?
Yes. But
all I'm hearing right now is that Daniel lost money in Seattle by being bumped into doggy style by some person he didn't know.
No. He tried to demand that I pay for a meal for him. And I was like, no way, dude. You came and ran into me. There's a very wide berth here. If you're going to pretend to bump into somebody, at least do it where there's a very tight area. And he did not take too kindly to that. But anyway, those are my connections to Chester Miner via T.T. Miner, via a canoeing accident, and a elementary school in the neighborhood I lived in.
I don't know
what this has to do with the movie. Not a whole lot.
What's going on here? What are we talking about? I don't understand.
What are we even talking about?
So crowdsourcing as a means of creating useful information. That's what we need to get back to, because that is a libertarian innovation.
That's right. That was all voluntarily done.
And that was early crowdsourcing.
Didn't accept to take any payment. They just did it because they wanted to be helpful.
And it's important with the crowdsourcing, like if you have distributed information, such as in every individual's mind, or, distributed, computer networks or something like that, the information is not useful unless there are nodes of expertise that are capable of discriminating between what is useful and what isn't. But once you have those nodes of expertise, you have very powerful means by which you can, collate and distribute knowledge and turn it into something useful. And in fact, this is what the market does naturally. It's that we have information coming into the market daily through the preferences of every individual who wants something of the market. And then there are relative experts, usually we call them entrepreneurs, who discriminate between good knowledge and bad knowledge based on their expertise, and then collate that into some useful piece of information, either price systems going out or price systems coming in. So the use of the crowdsourcing with distributed nodes of knowledge there. I mean, they couldn't just crowdsource to any, moron on the street who, was singing like a sea shanty or something like that. It had to be educated people who had some basis of knowledge and still edited by us educated men, as they say in the movie. And I think it's, it's a model.
Yeah, it's not
for
Wikipedia here. Come on.
Yeah, but it's a model for how distributed information systems are naturally superior to, I guess, centrally planned ones.
Yeah, I thought that it was a really interesting concept, though I wondered how it would work in practicality. I sort of understand, like, they're having all of these people submit this information, and then they're the ones organizing it and collating it and making meaning out of it. But wouldn't there be, like, so many repeats? Like, how would they control for that other than, oh, we already have this one, discard, 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 or whatever. And then they had Chester Minor going after the ones that they had difficulty like finding in the 17th century or the 18th century or whatever. So he was like he was able to deep dive and find those words in the literature in certain periods of time where they were missing, because I guess they needed to have a full history for whatever reason. I guess that was just like one of the parameters they'd sort of set up ahead of time. But it just seemed like I didn't understand how this system would functionally work with just all this random data coming at them.
Well, and I don't know if they did a great job in the movie of portraying this, but the rules for participation came out in, monthly encyclicals, either the newspaper or in this case, it was the Philological Society had its newsletter that would go around. And, in all of England, maybe you have like 6,000 people that read the Philological Society's newsletter, but then, 10%, 600 or so will participate in a similar endeavor, and they just have to follow the rules. Like whatever it is, we're looking for these words. There's a list of say 100 of them. Find quotations, cite them. Write out the entirety of the context, the entire paragraph, the entire sentence, with the name of the author, the book, the page, the title, the year, and they would just do that. So like every month they'd say, okay, we got through the A's, now we're going through the B's, now we're going through the C's.
Okay, so the words were provided then.
Yeah, and not dissimilarly, right? So, and obviously there are a lot of words that, they could do themselves, but it was words like art, where it has so much meaning. I mean, we use the word art in a million different ways. It has so many contexts. It's used so often. It doesn't just mean painting. It doesn't just mean pottery. It means every single type of constructive, valuable work that is aesthetically pleasing in some way or another, right? Because that's what we mean when we say art. In fact, the word art itself is an ancient word. It's like the word poetry. Which is originally Greek. It's typically considered to be quote unquote pregnant with meaning, because we don't even know how to define it. It's such a broad class of such an abstract concept.
It contains a ton of human expression. There's just so much that qualifies as art, or we understand to be art.
And the Greek word poema literally just means like creation in a sense. That's probably not even a really good translation of it. The best I can describe it is, if you remember the story about Athena being born fully grown out of the head of Zeus after he had a headache. That was one of the earliest usages of the word poema to describe the birthing of a concept out of the mind. So, but it's a similar word, art, poem. What do these even mean? It's extremely difficult to define. The breadth of use would be almost insurmountable. It would take 100 pages just to describe it.
Now, with that sort of happening through an evolutionary process, a naturally and organic, spontaneous order sort of happening, if through a little Hayek concept in. But what about the inverse of that, where we seem to see things like Orwellian newspeak, doublespeak, the changing of words and the repurposing of words and the stealing of words, like liberal in the sense that it means today is vastly different than what liberal meant 100, 150 years ago. In fact, it's almost the antithesis. And you see this happen so many times where words are going to be basically destroyed so that you affect people's thinking and ability to have thinking and critical thought. And we see limitations in speech and limitations in the intent and meaning of words, to where we're not as able to have meaningful discussion or debate, which seems to be almost a purposeful orchestrated plot of some sort by the powers that be, if you will, who would be threatened by people actually having constructive debate about topics.
Well, and the good thing about language is that we can invent new words, right? So words exist in order to define concepts that relate to human experience. So when we use the word liberal from the Latin libere, meaning free, we mean it because we understand what freedom means. Freedom means, within the contextualized use of the word, being unbounded by others who would seek to restrain us, right? And so if for some reason the word liberal no longer means believing in freedom, but instead, believing in, freedom from consequence, or potentially from liberal to constraint within a social order, right? Then we would just invent new words to describe what we mean by liberal, right? So we would develop a new word like libertarian or freedom lover, or we would just invent new words. And this is one of the real benefits of rhetoric, which is something the right wing is super weak in. They are so obsessed with maintaining classic order. They're the people in this context who want to regulate and discern the language and define it without describing it, prescribing it, defining it, making it subject to their expertise and whims. When in fact, dude, if the liberals have stolen your word, come up with a new one and make them look like fools. Make them seem like the old fuddy-duddies, which they are at this point. I mean, a lot of people complain that the Republican Party is like the party of old people, and it is to some extent. But is that not true of the Democrats? I mean, for to a very real extent, the Democrats are basically a couple of old rich academics, a handful of billionaires, and a bunch of kids who can't figure out what gender they are. They really aren't as strong as they think they are. They just happen to control a lot of institutions. And likewise, how would you fight that? Invent new words. Be the poets. Be the new cool kids on the block who are inventing new concepts and terms.
So would you say that, because the progressives really they're doing their darndest to take the word racism and have it apply to just about everything. and white supremacy to just about everything. But racism now means what? Privilege plus power, or whatever it is they're saying these days. Are we just supposed to give that to them and then develop a new words, or should we fight them and hold on to the old definitions?
I think you can fight them, but if for some reason you lose, it's not a loss. And I think that's my point, is that even if for some reason you lose, it's not the end of it, because you can invent new words. You don't have to use that word. You could never use the word racist after that. In fact, it might not even be good to use the word racist, because in a sense, combating doublespeak with doublespeak, Orwell argued that if a word does not exist to describe a concept, then it disappears from people's minds. Well, I disagree, because obviously human experience transcends the words themselves, because somebody has hated us no matter what we do. So the word hate is not going anywhere, even if for some reason we were to eliminate it from the language. We've all experienced somebody's hating us. We would just come up with a new word to describe that feeling. Likewise, with this, we could basically just say we don't you could almost say we don't recognize that term. It's a stupid term. It's a meaningless term. It has no definition. It's the same as if I were to just say some nonsense word like gobbledygook or something like that. It's like it's whatever I want it to mean. It's like sploosh. It's onomatopoeia.
Yeah, and it seems to be like when they do apply it to everything, it does lose its meaning and intent and purpose of a defined word and a defined thing. If they apply it to everything, then it loses the context and purpose for being.
And that's exactly the problem, right? Like nobody, or at least an increasing number of people, are no longer afraid of the word racist. Now, the problem is some of them have then embraced it. Well, if you're going to call me racist and it doesn't mean anything anymore, I'll show you what racist really is, which is not good either. But yeah, I mean, it's taking the sting out of that word, and taking the sting out of white supremacy. It takes the sting out of sexism, and you go forth and you can even make fun of those words to some extent. You'll have subcultures that use sexism or racism as like joke words because they don't mean anything anymore.
Right. Yeah. And part of it is like just the, the oversupply, the overuse of the word, is people become sort of like used to hearing it and it becomes almost normalized. But then also when it's applied to almost every conceivable thing, it loses any definition of what it is. And that's kind of the point of a word, is to define something or describe something in the human experience. But when it loses the ability to do that, then it becomes almost a nonsense word.
Like how the word asshole used to describe somebody who was actually a jerk, and now it just describes somebody who disagrees with you. So I embrace the term.
Obviously. Well, I don't know if anyone has any other points they want to bring up before we get into our final summary and review, and we can give a number of volumes out of 10 of what we want to give a score for this one.
I have one more thing on my list. If you don't mind, if you will allow me, gentlemen. So
you are so permitted.
I thought there was one curious element in the film where the good doctor of the sanitarium there, right before he was about to purge Mr. Minor, good Dr. Minor, he asked for his consent. And he's like, do I have your consent to begin this treatment? And even when he was answering to another person, he was like, yes, I have his consent to start this round of treatment or whatever. And I question, I mean, since he's held there against his will, obviously he's there in chains and he's not allowed to leave. It's more of a prison, but they call it a sanitarium, like they're trying to treat him and get him better. I'm curious, would they have just kept him locked, but they wouldn't have done the treatment? Were they promising, they're like, we don't know if this is going to actually do anything, but we're going to try this out? I mean, these were people where phrenology, studying the lumps in the shape of the skull, is like the height of their understanding of human disease and that kind of thing. And then purging, which isn't far removed from bloodletting, which is what the ancient Greeks practiced. I mean, we're talking like ancient like barely understanding human bodies. So much of the fact that they're just like, well, I'm going to shove my finger down your throat, and then hopefully you'll spit the crazy out. I mean, that's basically what they're trying to do. I mean, they didn't really understand the causes. At least they didn't show in the film any real attempt to understand the source of his anxiety, the source of his demons that, was happening. And it really seemed to me that, I mean, of course, they didn't have, like modern medications that would help him with his anxiety, that kind of thing. But they didn't even really have, I mean, Freud existed at this time, and before this, other psychoanalysts and that kind of thing. It seemed to
Freud
me
was
that
like in his 20s.
a good therapist or a good somebody to help him work through his guilt, this massive amount of guilt that he carried around with him, is really what he really needed to purge himself of. But I mean, of course, he probably had some other things where he was like picking his nose hairs and thinking they were like space invisible dust or whatever it was. I mean, he had issues, but it seems to me that there's a perverse incentive structure also, where I'm sure these doctors, they want to keep their patients and then cure them in an attempt to, hey, I'm helping people. I'm also, maybe I can develop some new treatment that's going to, I can write about and help out the rest of the world too. But it seemed to me that, and this is the case with a lot of places, and I don't know, I mean, especially true in like schools, where schools get a certain amount of money per student that they have. And I am assuming that these sanitariums were probably government funded, and they probably got paid for each case that they had, each inmate that they had, and they were probably less than likely to say, hey, guess what? You're cured. Off you go. And probably more likely to be like, no, we think you're still sick. Yeah, I think I could use an extra yacht, and I think you're actually quite sick. So these days, I know there's been a big push to get rid of sanitariums, and then people are basically just, I don't know, kicked out, and then you got homeless, crazy people walking around all the time. I think that's a case of people think that the government should be doing this and private charities aren't doing as much. And then, of course, the housing is a nightmare with all the regulations, and they're unable to meet the demands. But I don't know. You probably guys have a few thoughts on basically what I've been rambling about for the past few minutes. Are you happy, sad to see sanitariums go? I mean, I'm kind of happy. I've heard all kinds of horror stories about perfectly healthy people who might have had a bad day or been, going through some trying times, basically just locked up in the sanitarium and thrown away the key. And I think I've seen a few movies to that effect where like a guy used to be able to just say like, oh, my wife is crazy, so away she goes. And then she loses all her property rights, all kinds of things. And she's basically just treated like a crazy person for the rest of her days in a basic.
Are you saying that's a bad thing? I'm confused. What's going on here?
Asshole, you can decide for yourself what your opinion of that situation is.
Right. It seems pretty obvious to me that that's the correct situation.
Being able to just say, hey, this is a crazy person. You need to lock her away for a while. And
why not?
The rest of her natural life.
Happens at least once a month. Come on.
It's a perfectly libertarian thing to do.
I agree.
Okay, we're on the same page here.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
My basic opinion is sanitariums are a lot like the death penalty. Technically speaking, I believe in them. I just don't believe in the government doing them.
Yeah, there's all kinds of perverse incentive structures when government does, and of course they do everything terribly. So
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
but having a place where people who are not able to function within a normal constraints of society seems like a thing that would be a charitable and necessary thing for people, and maybe not for a long period of time, but maybe for a period of time in which they have sort of broken from reality,
which for some people is permanently. Right.
But for some people, I mean, Robert and I, we know some people who have had psychotic breaks or periods of time like manic episodes and things like that. And then when they come back from that, they're the person you knew. I mean, they're the same person and they're doing the same stuff they were doing before when you knew them, and there was no like apparent issue. And then the other point that I wanted to, I thought you were sort of driving towards this at the beginning of your questioning, Robert, was could Minor actually provide consent to the doctor in the condition he was in?
Right.
He's in there due to reasons of insanity. He's accused of this murder, and he did the murder, and they put him in this asylum because of insanity. Well, then, if he's insane and then he's devolving or getting worse, he's getting worse in there, then when you ask him for his consent, is he actually able to provide it or not? Or are they just going through the vestigial emotions?
He's insane, then how could he possibly give consent? Informed consent.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, to a certain extent, I think we both recognize, based on the individual condition, that Minor had times of lucidity. And it may have been during one of those times of lucidity that he had given consent. But let's assume, for instance, that he was never lucid. In such a case, that person would be described as not having any moral agency. They're no longer lucid and capable of making rational judgments for themselves, in which case they revert to a childlike state where some ward has to take over for them and has to make decisions regarding their good or ill. And this happens all the time, and not just with children, obviously, where we have that problem all the time, but at some point people get old enough, and it's not the same age for every person. It's nowhere near the same age, but sooner or later, if a person doesn't die first, they get so old that they simply cannot take care of themselves, and they no longer can make rational decisions. And the children usually tend to step in and take over for decision-making capability and try to do it as best they can. But at some point, there's a little bit of contention in when and how exactly this occurs, because you want to do it respectfully to your parents. But at some point, for any of those who have aged parents, as I have, you have to start saying, hey, no, you can't make that decision anymore. I'm going to make that decision for you.
Or maybe
it's not
you
always
shouldn't be driving.
Or maybe, maybe you shouldn't be driving. Maybe you shouldn't be handling your own finances anymore. I mean, I had a major problem with my mom after my dad passed away. She almost ruined herself overnight because she would not listen to my advice. And, for your listeners to understand, I'm a financial professional, a highly certified financial professional. And, in her refusal to listen to me, she nearly ruined herself. And who's going to make up the responsibility for that? Who's going to take that up? Me. Right? So she has you either have to listen to me and do what I say, and in that case I will care for you and I have the ability to do so, or you're going to be on your own, and the way you're ruining your finances, you're going to be on the street real soon. And that's not a pleasant conversation to have. It's not something you really want to force on somebody that you otherwise love. But she was not in a state of mind where she was making good, useful, rational choices, and I had to step in and say, okay, that's it. You can't ruin yourself anymore and then expect me to potentially bail you out.
Yeah, it almost seems like a similar situation with Minor. They're asking for his consent for this thing. Well, with your mom, and I this is getting into weird territory for the show, but
Right.
Like if she's making such decisions, then you confront her with another decision. Well, how can you trust that she's going to make the decision because of the presumption of the reason that you even presented this was that she's not capable of making such decisions? It just seems like a catch-22 almost.
It is. But we have that same problem with everybody. Like in their early life, they are not capable of making their own decisions. We make decisions for them. They eventually develop the ability to make decisions for themselves. And then at some point, they either die or they lose that ability. And hopefully they lose that ability very, very late. But, frequently happens, let's say, starting at 75, which is not that old.
80,
but yeah.
80, 81,
or 80,
old,
right. We don't know when. Some people lose it at 65. Some
I
people
was referring
65
to
are.
someone living in a walled city.
Ah,
I think
gotcha.
I think he's lost it. But anyway, we should get into the final summary review. I'm sure we avoided your question quite appropriately, Robert. So why don't you lead us off? Give us the number of volumes out of the Oxford Dictionary that you would give this out of 10.
Well, I thought it was a completely engaging story. I thought it was very well done. Towards the end, I can imagine they probably were working off historical material, and they didn't have like any kind of information about the widow other than her interactions at the sanitarium. So the movie just kind of forgets her at the end. But yeah, I thought this movie was fantastic. I found myself shedding tears many times. I found it very tragic. All these characters I felt it did a really good job humanizing all of them. Like at the beginning when, he's running and chasing after this random guy in the street and he's trying to kill him. I'm hating him as much as probably the widow, not as much as the widow ultimately, but I'm like, yeah, screw this guy. But then as you get to know him and understand the demons he's plagued by, you find out how flawed and how much he struggles and how much weight he carries, how much guilt he has. And I can't help but sympathize with that guy, even though he's a murderer. And of course, he did his best to make amends by offering up his pension to her. And he said he owes her his life because he took the life from her. I mean, ultimately, he took the life from the husband, but he's not around to, be made whole. So what else can you do? But, it's a movie filled with great human relationships. The friendship between Mel Gibson and Sean Penn, even the relationship between Mel Gibson and his wife is an excellent adult one that is filled with great conversations. There are a few scenes that I question about whether they needed to be there, or maybe that was what the director was talking about. But I'm not really going to nitpick it. I think overall it's so strong that it deserves to be seen. It deserves to be seen by a wide audience. I think this one really flew under the radar. I mean, there's so much content out these days. So much content. And with ad blockers on, I am just unaware of so much of it because I refuse to watch YouTube ads for the most part. I mean, here and there I will. I'll watch them on my phone here and there. But I just basically am ignorant of a lot of new stuff coming out. And I think a lot of people are, because these movies aren't making as much money as they used to, and the budgets are coming down, except for the giant big blockbuster stuff. Like I think we've talked about in the past, where there's a less and less middle road stuff where budgets were like 100 million. You're either getting like 10 million, 15, 20 million tops, or you're getting like 200 million. You're not getting a whole lot of stuff in between because it's just a big gamble, and the movies aren't necessarily making their money back. With all the different options on all the different streaming services. I mean, it really is a Wild West smorgasbord for content these days. Not to say that it's all great, of course, but there's just a lot of options. But this movie, it deserves to be seen by a lot of people. I think it's fantastic. I think this is a 9 out of 10. It was such a human story. I would be surprised if this wasn't one of my top movies of 2021. Wow. What was it? What were we talking about? Nine
volumes of the Oxford Dictionary.
9 volumes of the Oxford Dictionary out of 10. Even though there was 27 of them? Whatever, who knows?
Whatever the number is, but we're only going out of 10, just so there's like some kind of sense of scale here. All right, well, very good. 9 out of 10. That's a really high score from a guy who usually hates movies. Or most of the ones we do here anyway.
If you grab me by the heartstrings, you got me. And I think this movie did a great job of playing on that with all the different human relationships that really seemed authentic to me. So,
all right, very good. Well, how about you, Professional Asshole? What's your take, and how many volumes do you give this?
So I am obviously really impressed by this movie, not just in terms of agreeing with Robert in terms of the human relationships and their adult relationships. It's right. They're complicated relationships. They're not just simple relationships of like, you and I are on the same team, so let's work together. Like there is an actual give and take. There's witty banter between Miner and Murray, between their languages, between their use of words, and you know, the words themselves are a point of amusement, and you know, even a function of the plot within the story, like when Miner uses the word assithment in order to describe his failing mental condition, and when you know Murray goes to look it up, he remembers that it's an offering in recompense for a debt owed, right? And that, you know, that's meant to be a meaningful plot point within the movie. And I want to, you know, applaud Mel Gibson's acting chops in this as well. I mean, you know, in his early career, obviously wasn't much of an actor. He was just an action star, but he's really developed not only as a storyteller and a writer, but even eventually as an actor, to the point where that scene where he goes in at the assessment scene specifically, and Miner is pushing him away by being aggressive and, you know, argumentative and, you know, aloof. And you know, Murray starts to tear up. He doesn't really tear up, but he's clearly on the verge of wanting to cry, saying, you know, you're my friend. Why are you saying these things to me? You know, it demonstrated that Mel has really developed as an actor into his old age. He's no longer obviously focused on just being, you know, the good-looking guy with abs like he wasn't up through about 2000, but now is very much in the you know, developed actor, writer, and director stage. Even if most of his movies are low budget these days, very low budget, and you know, entirely self-financed. And a final point I really want to make is, for those who didn't know, you know, Sean Penn has obviously had a lot of difficulties in his own life, but he's an incredible actor. And the reason he's in this movie is because he and Mel, despite being on very opposite ends of many spectrums, are actually friends in real life, because you know, Mel used to be a real heavy drinker, as I've mentioned in my previous episode regarding him. He's a real heavy drinker and, you know, a jerk, and, you know, he smokes a lot, and he always had problems. And so when Sean Penn had his alcohol and drug problems in the mid 90s, and, you know, ended up slapping Madonna around and getting arrested a few times, Mel was the one who was there for him and pulled him out. And this is the same with Robert Downey Jr. and a few other major Hollywood actors who, after so many, you know, scandals that Mel Gibson has been in, they refuse to throw him under the bus, and they keep coming his defense, even if they're, you know, like Jodie Foster, who's like a, you know, a lesbian or something like that, and, you know, is not supposed to be on Mel's side. She keeps coming to his defense. And Sean Penn, who's a famous, you know, super environmentalist lefty guy, keeps coming to his defense. And Robert Downey Jr., who I don't know if he has major, you know, political persuasions, but, you know, he keeps coming to Mel Gibson's defense. And all of these people have been personally helped by Mel. So even though he's got some serious flaws in and of himself and of his own character, as I mentioned in the last episode, Edge of Darkness, Mel seems to, personally speaking, have enough cachet and charisma and value as a person that people are willing to forgive him who know him personally. And that in and of itself is interesting to note in such a well-developed movie with two really exceptional actors. So I agree with Robert. I give it 9 out of 10 volumes.
Wow, very good, very good. Well, that's a really very high score from both of you. I don't want to give into the peer pressure. I did enjoy this movie quite a bit. I wasn't thinking a 9, but maybe an 8.5 volumes of the Oxford Dictionary for me. The other thing I noticed about this is it's really well shot. Like, there's just some beautiful cinematography in here. The acting is brilliant. There are a lot of like intricate relationships, as you guys both talked about. And even though the storyline is about, you know, like compiling a dictionary and these etymology of words and where things come from, seems like a pretty boring topic just in general. But they ended up making it quite interesting. Though I do think it does get a little bit muddled here and there. Like, I didn't feel the weight of when Murray goes to his friend, his confidant, and says that he's lost everything. I didn't really kind of grasp like what he was referring to, other than the relationship with his friend and perhaps like losing control of editing the dictionary. And then the little strip of parchment that had a saying on it seemed kind of just tacked on at the end, and I wonder if that was another like piece that was supposed to be more prominently stitched through the story, so it would have a little bit more meaning. So I wonder if that's what some of the things that went missing from the director not having final cut that might have strayed a little bit from the story that the director was trying to tell versus what ended up being the final result. But overall, 8.5 for me. I think it's a really good movie. I well recommend it. And Mel Gibson does have some acting chops, as of course does Sean Penn. And it was a lot of fun. So I do thank you, Professional Asshole, for the recommendation. It was the second time I saw it. I did watch it over Christmas based on your recommendation initially. And upon watching it, I was like, yeah, this could be a good one for us to do on the show. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right.
Yeah, that goes for me too. I wouldn't have seen this great movie if it weren't for this show. So cool.
All right.
As much,
this show's good
as many
for something.
stinkers as I have to watch, then I deserve a few good ones.
That's right.
Did you guys ever do Captain America: The Winter Soldier?
Not for the show. That's one of my favorite Marvel movies.
Yeah, we should maybe consider doing that. That's got some great libertarian themes.
It sure does.
Yeah,
Giant
maybe.
death barges in the sky that can kill everybody. Yeah, that's probably
Social credit system.
Not the most libertarian thing ever, but
yeah, I'd be game for that. Well, anyway, we're going to have the show notes and more, of course, for this and your prior appearances, Professional Asshole, and that'll be at lastnighters.com/167, of course, with Edge of Darkness on there, and From Russia with Love, 310 to Yuma, and I want to say you did a few other ones with us. I can't quite recall what they are, but I'm sure they were really good. Oh, that's right, Last Jedi, yes. Oh, yeah, I do recall that my power went out, like right towards the end of that, and you guys had to cover for me at the end.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
Yeah, but that goes back into the archives a little bit. That's I think that was episode 58, maybe 57, episode 57 of the Actual Anarchy show. So yeah, and here we are, 224 of Actual Anarchy. Anyway, that's our show for tonight, and next week we're going to be doing the movie Chef with Jared Wall of Breaking Liberty and Anarcho Land joining us. This is one that he recommended, so he's bringing this to the table in honor of Robert, my co-host, who operates a restaurant, and I think that he should have some interesting takes on this. And I think that will be a lot of fun. The other option was another Indian film, another Bollywood film, which I don't even know how to say it, but it's called Anandhan or something like that. And then the other option was American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington, which I saw recently, and I do think it has a shitload of stuff worth talking about. So maybe that is one that we should do at some point in the future, either with Jared or perhaps with Keith Knight, as Keith, who was our guest last week, is big on the gangster movies.
Yes, he is. Hey, Daniel, just one point of clarification. This is Chef 2014, is it? There's a couple of chefs.
It's whatever one has Jon Favreau, I believe.
Johnny Fav.
And he's got like a, what do you call it? A food truck?
Yeah.
Okay.
John Leguizamo as well.
Okay. Yeah. Chef 2014 is what we're doing. Okay, sounds good.
All right, so that'll be the one. So our audience, thank you guys for joining us as well. You can find the show notes, like I said, at lastnighters.com. So /167. You can also find pre-show and post-show bonus content. Post-show content is called Kathleen Turner Overdrive. And if you are a Patreon supporter, you can get a piece of that at lastnighters.com/Patreon. And Robert, a couple more things that they could do if they want to support us before we sign off. And we'll see everyone next week.
Yeah, you can always leave like, share, subscribe, give us some reviews, positive, negative. You can ask questions. You can tell people, friends, family about it. You can just live your life and give the middle finger to all tyrants. If that tyrant is some Karen telling you got to wear a mask, or some guy saying you have to social distance, or if it's some asshole who thinks they know everything and what's best for all these people. They seem to have like medical degrees, and they seem to know that every single person in the state is part of their like doctor, like client privilege situation. I don't know. It's a bizarre time we live in, where government seems to know what's best for everybody. And I mean, they always think they know what's best, or that they are the nannies and the caretakers. But especially when it comes to your health, they can't possibly know what's best for each and every person. So you are responsible for you. So live like it, act like it, and you'll be doing us a solid.
All right, and I'll just tack on one other thing. You know, if it was all about health, and they would be talking about things like, oh, I don't know, exercise, diet, vitamin intake, things that actually promote health versus just this fear.
Things that damage people's psychological health, you mean?
Yes, that as well. So anyway, that's our show, and we will see you guys all next week for Chef, and we'll be getting into the Kathleen Turner Overdrive after these messages. Peace out, everyone. Good night from last night. All right, in just a few more minutes of the actual Anarchy podcast before we get into the Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which I'm not sure how long that will go because it is a Tuesday night and it is late for our guest, and I still have work to do tonight myself. But I didn't want to leave without asking this question of each of you, co-host and guest. The assessment, which was the repayment for debt owed, was that his cutting off of his penis, or was that he was suicidal, and that's what prompted Murray to rush to the hospital to try to intervene and prevent that from happening? Because it seemed like there was this realization when Murray's wife said what the parchment, what the response was from the widow, like if not love, then, and then that was what prompted him to realize that something needed to happen. Like it seemed like there was something that had to happen.
Well, it seemed to me. Go ahead, professional asshole.
It seemed, I was going to say, it seems to me that the payment that he's making is the living exclusively to provide for the family, right? So I think the issue is if he dies, they stop getting the pension. So he doesn't want to live, but he can't kill himself. So how does he cut himself off from all human activity while still remaining alive, technically? Well, the first thing you can do is you can cut off any ability to live beyond yourself. Right, and the first one is cutting off your penis, which is, by the way, far more dangerous than if he had cut off his testicles. Right, as a doctor, he would have known this. Cutting off your testicles is like, you can recover from that fairly quickly. I know that sounds odd, but it's true. But your penis obviously has like a lot of like vessels in it, and you will bleed out very, very quickly. In fact, you'll probably die. It was historically considered to be a death sentence. So that was almost him getting as close as he was willing to get to death. But at the same time, he can't physically die, because if he does, then he can't provide the assistment that he wants to provide. And it's interesting, there's another word that gets used in Tolkien once or twice. It's not very common. It's a word called weregild, which means gold for a man. And it's a similar concept. It's the payment that you make in order to repay a debt for killing a person. So, but this word, the word weregild, is used in Tolkien to describe, by Elrond specifically, to describe why Elrond did not kill Isildur when he could have just shoved him into the boiling lake of lava. He didn't do it because he figured that would have been wrong, but two, he considered the ring to be the weregild to Isildur for the death of his father. So he refused to take it from him. So a similar concept.
Okay,
Yeah.
Robert, your take on the cutting off of the penis?
It seemed to me that he felt that he had betrayed the deceased by murdering him, taking away his life unjustly, of course. And he had robbed the widow of her husband. And he wanted to, and then he cut off his penis, and I don't know, maybe it's just, I don't know exactly, he didn't show exactly what he did, thankfully.
It was his penis. I had to look it up.
Oh, in real life he actually did?
Yeah.
It seemed to me that he was cutting that off to prevent any of his desires. I mean, that probably only increases desires. I don't know, but it seemed to me like he was so haunted by this second betrayal of her loving him, him loving her, and then her loving this relationship that was blossoming, so to speak, that haunted him because that was a further betrayal on the deceased, killing him a second time, right? And then he's horrified that he'd killed him a second time. He's so tortured by his past acts that he just couldn't deal with it, and he just had to remove any chance of any kind of relationship like that ever happening, even though he was probably already in a situation.
Did they have a conjugal visit? They seem to sort of allude to one when they go to that hedged area with the private door and the guard. Forget the guy's name, but he's like very helpful throughout the whole movie. Kind of gives them some private time alone. Muncie, that's right.
I think that was meant to be I think that was meant to be in his head. I think because that was the scene. That scene that you're talking about happened right before he woke up and decided to cut off his own penis.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, where she gives him the piece of parchment that says, "If love, then what?"
Right. So I think the idea of their blossoming romance, it comes to a certain point where she gives him a kiss and hands him the note and then runs off and apologizes for her daughter. But then he in his own mind has an extension of that fantasy where he takes her into a quiet gardened area of the asylum and they kiss a little more. We don't see anything beyond that, but it seems to me that probably happened in his head and was the impetus for him to emasculate himself. Right,
because she says to him, and if it's in his head, then it makes more sense to me that the result would be what he did. Because she says to him in this scene, "Yeah, you took my husband, but I almost think it's a good thing, or I almost prefer it in a way." And I thought that if she would have really said that in, like, obviously it's a movie, but if that was what she'd said to a crazy person in real life, that would be something to push them over the edge of some sort. Like, that would seem to be a dangerous thing to say to somebody. Like, "Yeah, you killed him, and I almost think it's better. Yeah, sure, I loved him, but
For someone that carries around that much guilt over what he's done, it
seems like an unnecessary flourish for her to say something like that. When she could just say, "I've forgiven you, and I care for you now."
Right. She was trying to say that, I'm moving past it, and I'm becoming more and more okay with it, and I'm seeing the positives that could come out of it, of this horrible situation. And he's like, no, there is no recovery, there is no atonement. His identity is one of carrying around with this guilt. He can't imagine a life without this guilt. And she was basically robbing him of this guilt. And he can't deal with that. That's a psychotic break right there.
Right. The thing he could do is focus on something productive. Like, he could focus his intellect and his mental energy at some kind of project to kind of forget the guilt or the other things that are tormenting him.
Right, like he said that he disappears into the books. He doesn't. All the guilt doesn't follow him in when he's reading.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's where he said he's the pursuer and he's like truly free, can travel anywhere beyond these walls and things like that. Yeah. So maybe that's what we should all be doing during these lockdowns is just reading.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that had to do with the concept of redemption that they were trying to establish within that, and more specifically, a very Christian view of redemption as opposed to just some generic one of like the assessment of paying what you owe. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that early on, when he first meets James Murray, he says, I don't feel God's presence. I see you're a man of faith and you feel God's presence. And I wish I did. I don't very often. And he says to him at first, you will, my friend. And as their relationship develops, obviously, he gets to the point where he is rejecting redemption. He's being offered redemption by the wife, who is saying, as much as the pain you caused me was painful, the blessing that you have given me with your friendship and with the money that you've given me and the fact that my forgiveness of you is causing you to recover. He didn't want that. He rejected it. He pushed it away. He didn't want God's redemption. He didn't want God's love. Almost in a callback to like some of the themes of crime and punishment, but similar concept. And then he goes into his catatonic state, and it's only eventually when both Murray, he's pushed away Eliza, and he's pushed away Murray, and he's pushed away the doctor, and he's basically died. That's I think the suggestion they're trying to make. He's died spiritually. The doctor even says it's a question of whether or not the soul even remains in the body. But she eventually comes back and says, if love, then what? And the answer is not that her husband has died. It's that if love, then redemption. Right? And that's the word that's written on the piece of parchment. And because of that, that is when he starts to become alive again. He wakes up. He's able to come to his own court hearing. He's able to eventually go back to America to live with his family by being deported. He's able to become friends with Marie again. And he's able to leave the widow with as much as he can possibly give her. And in addition to all of that, he has contributed massively to this, unassailable project.
Right. Oh, yes. And there was one last thing I wanted to mention. I love the little fuck you at the end to the intellectual elite class using their own system against them as they plot and try to twist things to sabotage Murray and his efforts by getting the patronage of the Queen, because they have to respect it because that's part of their operating system or their operating code. I thought that was...
You went over my helmet?
Yes. Yeah, that was a nice little twist of the knife, and it made sure that they couldn't mess with him. Yeah, they'll
worship the Queen. So
yeah, I mean, if you got a system, then why not use it against them? Yeah, made sense. But anyway, this has been a lot of fun. Professional Asshole and Robert, and a good movie, strong recommendation, and great discussion. So thank you for that. And we'll of course be back next week with Chef, with Jared Wall. That'll be a lot of fun as well. So Professional Asshole, let's talk offline, and we'll get another movie in the hopper for, I don't know, maybe July or something like that. We're booked up until about then, but we'd love to have you back as always.
I appreciate that. I would look forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you, audience, and we'll see you guys all next week. And stick around for some Kathleen Turner Overdrive right after this, available at actualanarchy.com/Patreon. And you can find the show notes and more at actualanarchy.com/224. We'll see you guys all next week. Peace out and maximum freedom, everyone. Good night.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.